So the topic is psychedelic therapy and a philosophical view known as naturalism, and the question I want to address is, are these two things really in conflict as it might appear? And so there's a particular objection to psychedelic therapy that I call the Comforting Delusion Objection, which suggests that psychedelic therapy and naturalism are in conflict, and because of the plausibility of naturalism, we should be wary of psychedelic therapy. And so in my forthcoming book, what I basically am trying to do is to show that the Comforting Delusion Objection fails, and the positive side of that is trying to show that psychedelic therapy and philosophical naturalism can be reconciled. And so this talk is going to be a very broad, very brief overview of the argument for that. So there are two parts. In the first part, I'm going to introduce the Comforting Delusion Objection and the existing responses to it, and then in part two, I'm going to outline my response to it, which involves naturalizing what I call the entheogenic conception of psychedelics. So taking an entheogenic conception of psychedelics and showing that it can be made consistent with naturalism. So part one, the Comforting Delusion Objection. So we start with a bunch of reasonably well-established empirical facts, most of which will be familiar to one extent or another to most people in this room. So out of the psychedelic renaissance in the last sort of 20 or 30 years, we have considerable evidence now for the safety of moderate to high doses of serotonin 2A agonists in controlled conditions. We've had over 1,000 subjects from multiple different populations dosed under controlled conditions with no serious lasting adverse effects. And we also have mounting evidence for therapeutic and transformative efficacy. So there's a number of clinical trials showing in conditions like depression, addiction, and cancer-related psychosocial distress that 1 or 2 doses of a psychedelic, such as most often psilocybin, can lead to dramatic decreases in symptoms for many months, in some cases even sort of around a year. And then we also have these studies showing things like, increases in positive personality traits like openness to experience for upwards of a year following a single psilocybin experience. We've got increases in openness for a fortnight following an LSD experience. And we've got a body of evidence suggesting that mindfulness-related capacities can be increased by substances like ayahuasca, and that there are interesting interactions between psilocybin and meditation practices. So these are the basic facts that we start with, this kind of body of evidence for the safety and efficacy of the therapeutic and transformative use of serotonergic psychedelics. And then we sort of zoom in and take a slightly closer look at how exactly this works, right? So is there a common mechanism to these various uses? It seems as though there is. So across many of these studies, psychometric ratings of so-called mystical type experience predict lasting benefits. And this seems to be true both of the therapeutic benefits in psychiatric pathologies and also of the transformative benefits in healthy subjects. And so the definition of a mystical type experience, it's kind of operationalized by these psychometric scales, is that of an experience, it's drawn from the work of William James and Walter Stace, and it's the idea of an experience featuring these core phenomenological qualities despite sort of intercultural differences in interpretation and expression. The idea is that there is this core experience featuring a sense of unity, transcendence of time and space, ineffability, paradoxicality, the noetic quality, the sense that this is more real than real and real knowledge is being gained, the sense of sacredness, and so on. And so in light of this fact, in light of the fact that you've got this fairly robust correlation between ratings of mystical type experience and decreases in psychiatric symptoms as well as lasting positive personality change, you might be led to a conjecture, right? You might think, well, it seems plausible then that the mechanism whereby psychedelics bring about these lasting benefits is the induction of psychologically reassuring or comforting metaphysical beliefs, right? So somehow the psychedelic experience leads people to form or to reinforce beliefs about the ultimate nature of reality that somehow are psychologically comforting or uplifting. What kind of metaphysical beliefs specifically? Well, here's Benny Shannon talking about the sort of metaphysical perspectives that the ayahuasca subjects he interviewed were espousing. He said, look, ayahuasca induces a comprehensive metaphysical view of things, which he would characterize as idealistic monism with pantheistic overtones. So on this view, reality is conceived as constituted by one non-material substance, identified as cosmic consciousness, the Godhead, the ground of all being, and it's a sort of realization that all things are interconnected and constitute one harmonious whole. There's sense and reason to all things, and reality is invested with deep, heretofore unappreciated meaningfulness. And he thinks that this metaphysical perspective induced by ayahuasca is similar to views entertained in classical Hindu philosophy, as well as by Plato, Plotinus and Hegel, and it's the sort of view that Aldous Huxley called the Perennial Philosophy. And he says, look, I've heard ideas consonant with this metaphysical view from many of my informants, and no one reported to me metaphysical ideas that countered this view. So, if you're sympathetic to naturalism or physicalism, then you might be inclined at this point to wonder, as Michael Pollan did in his article in the New Yorker a few years ago, is psychedelic therapy simply foisting a comforting delusion on the sick and dying? And obviously this worry really kind of gets a grip when you're looking at the use of psychedelics in palliative care, because that's where it's most plausible, or it has the most kind of prima facie plausibility that this is what's going on, right? So you have people who have profound existential angst and psychological distress because of their impending mortality. They get given these drugs. Some of them have this mystical type experience, and those are the ones who experience lasting reductions in depression and anxiety. It's a very natural conjecture that they've experienced these reductions in symptoms because they've developed this kind of metaphysical belief that actually each of us deep down in our innermost being is identical to this non-spatial, non-temporal, divine ground of all being, and that is, the kind of comfort and the uplifting nature of that belief is what has led to their reduction in psychiatric symptoms. So I'm just going to say very briefly what I mean when I talk about philosophical naturalism. This is a term that is kind of highly contentious, and there are many, many different definitions of what naturalism is. I'm going to be running with a very rough, intuitive conception. So the slogan version of naturalism is the natural world is all there is, right? So the single world investigated and described by the natural sciences is all that exists. There's just the one closed causal system. Then, of course, you start wanting to define a lot of the key terms, like, what does it mean when we talk about the natural world? What exactly does natural mean? I don't propose to get into those sorts of definitional debates, because what I mean by naturalism in this context can be communicated quite readily. Basically, I'm talking about a worldview on which there are no disembodied minds, right? So there's no mentality or consciousness or experience without some sort of material substrate. There's no cosmic consciousness, there's no spirit world, and most fundamentally, mind and consciousness are not fundamental or universal or ubiquitous, they're actually emergent in a kind of innocent sense of that term. The minded develops out of complex arrangements of the non-minded. That's the sort of essential view of the world that I'm kind of lumping together under the rubric of naturalism. And so it's very similar to views that go in philosophy of mind by the names of physicalism and materialism. So basically, there is just the kind of natural world described by the sciences, and mind, consciousness are not fundamental. They kind of develop out of complex evolution. So, from this standpoint, you might kind of develop this worry about psychedelic therapy or psychedelic transformation. You might say, well, it's simply foisting a comforting delusion on the sick and dying. Three major extant responses to this worry, right? The first one is to say, well, it's not a comforting delusion because the cosmic consciousness is actually real. And a lot of psychedelic researchers take this line. You can find this sort of, and this would be to adopt a kind of idealist or a cosmopsychist or a sort of panpsychist, pantheist, some view, some metaphysical view of the world on which consciousness is in fact universal and ubiquitous, and therefore the apparent metaphysical insights facilitated by psychedelics are veridical. And this is a view that you get from psychedelic researchers, notably such as William Richards and Huston Smith. They say, well, this is actually the real ultimate nature of reality that people are tapping into under the influence of psychedelics. Now, I don't want to go down that road. The second response is to say, well, actually, it is a comforting delusion, but that doesn't really matter so much, right? So the philosophers Owen Flanagan and George Graham have conducted an analysis of psychedelic therapy in which they've said, look, these experiences are metaphysical hallucinations, right? They are kind of compelling and vivid apparent realizations of metaphysical aspects of reality that aren't real. But in actual fact, when we look at these kinds of mental states and the factors that might bear on whether we want to cultivate them or reject them, their epistemic status is not in the final analysis what's most important. It doesn't really matter so much whether they're real or not, and of course that can never be established with certainty anyway. What is more important is that they help people live better lives. So this is a kind of perspective according to which the pragmatic and the psychological benefits are far more important than the epistemic status and the question of veridicality. And the third response is basically to endorse the objection, to say, well, neither of those claims holds, right? It's not true that the cosmic consciousness is real, and it's not true that the epistemic status is relatively unimportant, so it's bad news for psychedelic therapy. We should worry because it is a comforting delusion, and that's a bad thing. So those are the three main responses to the objection that are out there in the literature at this point. So my response is slightly different. So as I said, my aim in the book is to show that the comforting delusion objection fails full stop, right? So this is what I want to establish, is that this objection to psychedelic therapy does not succeed. Now consider the various possibilities, right? If naturalism is false and some kind of idealist or cosmopsychist metaphysical view is true, clearly the objection fails. If, as Flanagan and Graham say, the epistemic status of the experience is relatively unimportant, clearly the objection fails, right? So what I then do is I assume the worst case scenario. I assume that naturalism is true and that the epistemic status of the psychedelic experience is important, and I try to show that even granted both those assumptions, the comforting delusion objection still fails. So that's the thesis, that's the kind of target, is to show that the objection fails even granted those two sort of worst case assumptions. And that then shows, you know, by extension, that the objection just fails full stop. So, and I mentioned that sort of conditional structure so that, you know, if you happen not to accept, because I personally do accept both those assumptions, right, that naturalism is true and the epistemic status is quite important, but if you happen not to accept either of those, then you can just treat it as a conditional exercise, right? So what should we say about psychedelic therapy on the assumption that naturalism is true and the epistemic status of the experience is important? And so there are essentially two parts. I think in the abstract I said there are three, but I'm cutting it down to two. These are the really important bits. And the first part is that as an empirical matter, I claim psychedelic therapy doesn't actually work primarily by changing people's metaphysical beliefs. So that's the negative part of the argument, is to say, well, actually, the comforting delusion objection relies on a misleading picture of the mechanisms of psychedelic therapy. And then the second positive part of the argument is to argue that psychedelic therapy is epistemically innocent, which is a technical term due to Lisa Bortolotti, which means that even though it has epistemic flaws, it also has significant and otherwise unavailable epistemic benefits. And so, as I say, the upshot of this is to show that an entheogenic conception, a conception of psychedelics as agents of spirituality and epistemic benefit, is both compatible with the physicalist or naturalist worldview and plausible in light of our best current scientific knowledge about psychedelics. So this is part two, which I think I have to go through in about 5 minutes, is naturalizing the entheogenic conception of psychedelic therapy. So at the heart of this comforting delusion objection is an empirical claim, which is that psychedelic therapy actually works by inducing non-naturalist metaphysical beliefs. Now, I think there's evidence against this from recent qualitative studies, right? So there are a number of studies of cohorts of patients treated with psychedelics for various conditions, and the findings of these studies are that successfully treated patients sometimes are talking about cosmic consciousness, but a lot of the time they're simply not, right? So a lot of the time you have patients who have satisfied psychometric criteria for a complete mystical experience who are not talking about everything is one, everything is consciousness, everything is love, right? Instead, they're talking about profound experiences of acceptance, connectedness, mindfulness, embodiment, and this kind of thing. Now this sounds strange, right? Because we said there's a correlation between mystical type experience and lasting benefits. How can that be if successfully treated patients are not talking about cosmic consciousness? The answer, quite simply, is that the psychometric construct of mystical type experience, as it's operationalized in current psychedelic research, is not specific to an experience as of cosmic consciousness. It's possible to satisfy all psychometric criteria for a complete mystical type experience, even though you haven't had any apparent metaphysical epiphany into the ultimate nature of reality. Now, I have my own sort of alternative view. Basically, the idea is that when people satisfy psychometric criteria for a mystical type experience, sometimes you've got this metaphysical content, the kind of cosmic consciousness component, sometimes you haven't. The common factor in all cases, I claim, is ego dissolution. So the kind of disintegration of the self-model and the introduction of representational opacity, so the ability to view one's own self-narratives and self-models as a model, as just a kind of story that is constructed, contingent, could be constructed otherwise. That, according to me, is the common denominator. That's the crucial factor that is therapeutically involved, whether you've got the metaphysical content or whether you haven't. Now, just to clarify, when you do have the metaphysical content, I think that makes a contribution, right? I'm not saying that's not doing any work, but I think this is the kind of common factor that is why and how mystical type experience leads to therapeutic and transformative benefits. And so when you have this disintegration of the self-model, you have alternative modes of attention, of self-modeling that can be discovered during the acute psychedelic experience and then consolidated during the post-session integration phase. And so, to be really clear, on my view, the psychedelic experience definitely matters, so it's not a pure non-experiential molecular mechanism, but on the other hand, it's not this kind of hardcore metaphysical content, it's ego dissolution and the ability to see alternative, more beneficial patterns of self-modeling and attention. So that's the first part. The second part of the argument is epistemic innocence. So this is the term that Lisa Bortolotti has coined to sort of encapsulate the mixed epistemic profile of some suboptimal or imperfect cognitive states that nonetheless afford significant and otherwise unavailable epistemic benefits. And so, from a naturalist or physicalist point of view, we have to say, look, psychedelics clearly do sometimes induce non-naturalist metaphysical beliefs, so they do have epistemic flaws, or at least epistemic risks. But, first of all, those risks are not absolute, so not everyone even has a kind of cosmic consciousness type experience. Of people who do, not everyone believes it uncritically, some people are kind of more agnostic about it. But in any case, even when you do have the epistemic harms of kind of increased belief in a cosmic consciousness or something like that, those epistemic harms are offset by significant and otherwise unavailable epistemic benefits, such as, well, first of all, I think psychedelics can facilitate the acquisition of a type of what philosophers call knowledge how, or ability knowledge. And so Benny Shannon makes a proposal that drinking ayahuasca can help you learn how to drink ayahuasca. So he has a paper on the potential epistemic benefits of the ayahuasca experience, and he sort of says, look, as people drink ayahuasca again and again over time, they can become skilled in the very art of drinking ayahuasca itself. And sort of, at first you might think this sounds a bit trivial, right? But I think there's actually something deep here. So I think one way of interpreting this, right? So what kind of skill is that? The skill of kind of drinking ayahuasca gracefully or well? Well, I think at least part of what it is, at least part of what it is not vomiting. At least part of what it is actually the ability to open to inner experience and pay attention in a curious, non-reactive way. So exactly the sorts of patterns of attention and ways of relating to inner experience that are deliberately cultivated in mindfulness meditation. And there's now evidence that ayahuasca, after the experience, does increase these kinds of capacities. There's a growing body of evidence concerning synergies between psychedelics and meditation training. And so my suggestion here is that psychedelic experiences can actually help facilitate the acquisition of that kind of knowledge how, the knowledge how to attend and relate to inner experience in a particular decentered, non-reactive way. Okay. Then there's what philosophers call knowledge by acquaintance, and I'm not going to get into the technical details of this, but you know, there's this sort of broad distinction that comes from Bertrand Russell between knowledge by description and knowledge by acquaintance. And on an intuitive level, you can understand it just as, you know, you might have knowledge about a person or a place by reading about it or them secondhand, some kind of knowledge by description or testimony that you can get sort of indirectly, and then you might have a direct kind of first-hand encounter with that person or place and become acquainted with them. And that's the sort of intuitive distinction that is at play in this idea of knowledge by acquaintance. Now, Russell actually...
So we have a little bit of time of discussion, and we take some time from David the next time.
Yeah, I can do that, thanks. Okay. Yes, I can definitely do that. So, well, I'll give you the kind of broad outline of these epistemic benefits, and then I can go into more detail about them if people are interested. So, I think that psychedelics facilitate this kind of knowledge by acquaintance, so it's kind of knowledge of a more immediate kind than any knowledge that is sort of indirect, theoretical or inferential, with two important facts. So first of all, the vast psychological potential of one's own mind, so kind of by transiently expanding the neurocognitive phenomenal state space beyond its ordinary confines. Users become directly acquainted with the fact that their minds have the potential to enter these many kind of vastly different states that they normally don't encounter in their day-to-day life. And this is related to the point about representational opacity. They also become directly acquainted with the constructed, contingent and mutable nature of their conscious experience in general. So you can kind of encounter directly the fact that, as Thomas was saying yesterday, perception is controlled hallucination. This can actually become directly manifest to you during the experience. And in particular, the contingent and mutable nature of the sense of self and identity. You can become directly acquainted with that in the experience, whereas otherwise it might merely have been a second-hand theoretical inference. I'm going to skip over new knowledge of old facts. Well, you know, I'm just going to say this is a kind of epistemic benefit that again can intuitively be articulated in terms of the difference between having a sort of mere intellectual belief that I'm mortal, I'm going to die one day, and on the other hand, having a direct kind of brush with death, a kind of you know, experience that leaves you extremely vividly with this kind of affective, bodily, rich sort of sensory awareness of your own mortality. So the idea is you can take the same information, the same knowledge, the same proposition, and present it in a different mode that makes it far more salient, far more affectively and motivationally efficacious. And there are findings relevant to this, right? So psilocybin increases affective but not cognitive empathy. So my interpretation of that is it doesn't increase your ability to determine what is the case, but it instead kind of enhances your ability to represent otherwise knowable facts in different modes of presentation. Finally, you can get indirect epistemic benefits, so durably elevated openness to experience plausibly is a pro-epistemic result, right? So you're more open, you're having more new experiences, engaging with different types of information and so on. And to the extent that psychedelic therapy restores psychosocial functionality in conditions like addiction and depression, you can get restored epistemic functionality as a flow-on effect. And finally, there is this direct empirical evidence from this study by Lyons and Carhart-Harris that people successfully treated with psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression become more accurate at forecasting positive events in their life. So before versus after treatment, they actually become more accurate in terms of you give them, here's a list of sort of 20 bad things and here's a list of 20 good things, and rate how likely it is that these things are going to happen to you in the next month. And my understanding is there's no change in their accuracy with respect to the bad things, but they get better at realistically predicting that good things can happen to me, and their objective accuracy on that front actually improves. So, brief summary, the causal role of the mystical experience gives rise to the Comforting Delusion Objection. The main responses that are out there so far are to say, well, it's not a delusion because naturalism is false, or to say that the epistemic status doesn't matter. And my response is to show that the objection fails even if Neither of those conditions holds. Two-pronged argument, the therapeutic and transformative mechanism is not metaphysical belief change, and the epistemic flaws are offset by significant, otherwise unavailable epistemic benefits. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Track is still missing, so I'm jumping in. Thank you for giving birth to this new branch of blitz philosophy, speed philosophy. Okay, we have 5 minutes for questions. I know that we could talk for 45 minutes, but what do you want to ask? Yes.
Isn't what you call the Pollan denominator, the ego dissolution, itself already a metaphysical aspect? You know, because it's a question how you actually have an understanding, a notion of cosmic consciousness. What does it mean? It's only a notion. But the fact of experience of ego dissolution isn't it itself a metaphysical aspect?
So the question was, so I've claimed that the common denominator in therapeutic and transformative mechanism is ego dissolution, not metaphysical belief change. The question is, well, isn't ego dissolution itself a metaphysical aspect? Maybe, maybe not. So it's not a metaphysical belief change. So this is an opportunity to get clear on one point. What I am not saying is that people, as a consequence of their psychedelic experiences, come to adopt the Buddhist proposition that the self does not exist, and that metaphysical belief is what helps them. I don't think that's what happens at all. In fact, I think it's very rare that you get someone, especially someone without any prior Buddhist inclinations, who comes out of a psychedelic experience saying the individual self does not exist. That doesn't seem to be the main point. So even if people do have that belief kind of instilled in them or strengthened, I don't think that's what's doing the work. I think it's instead that you get to see directly the possibility of other ways of modeling yourself, interpreting yourself, relating to your experience, and these are not metaphysical beliefs in the same sense, right? They're more psychological insights, they're kind of, they are beliefs, but I think a big part of what does the work is this acquaintance and modes of presentation. The fact that you've got this extremely direct encounter, this kind of existence proof, if you like, of the possibility of parsing your experience in different ways. So